2,000 years ago, a Roman battlefield medic packed a dying soldier's wound with spider webs, and that soldier lived, not because of luck. Because of chemistry, we're still publishing breakthrough research papers on, right now, in 2026. You've been told modern medicine is where all the real answers live. White coats, laboratories, machines that beep, that's the story. And for most of your life, it probably felt true. Here's what they didn't tell you. At least 3 of the cutting-edge medical discoveries you've heard about on the news in the last few years. Rome already knew. Rome was using them. Rome had already proven them, on real people, centuries before anyone had a microscope, or even knew what a bacteria was. Over the next several minutes, I'm going to hand you 7 of these forgotten Roman remedies, starting with one that's sitting in your medicine cabinet right now, and ending with something so strange the Roman government actually taxed it. By the end, you won't think of ancient medicine as primitive ever again. Let's start close to home. If you've ever reached for a bottle of aspirin because your knees were acting up or your head was pounding after a long day, you were unknowingly repeating a 2,000-year-old Roman ritual. Only they didn't have a pharmacy. They had a tree. Romans figured out that if you stripped the bark off a willow tree, chewed on it, or boiled it into a bitter tea, your pain would ease up. Your fever would break. This wasn't guesswork either. Roman physicians, and Greek physicians before them like Hippocrates, wrote about willow bark specifically for pain and fever, going back centuries before Rome even became an empire. By the time Roman army doctors were treating soldiers on the march, willow bark tea and willow leaf extracts were a standard part of the medical toolkit. Here's where it gets interesting. For those of you who've spent your whole lives taking aspirin without a second thought, the active compound Romans were unknowingly extracting from that willow bark is called salicin. Your body converts salicin into salicylic acid, and salicylic acid is the direct chemical ancestor of acetylsalicylic acid, which you know by its brand name, aspirin. In the late 1800s, a German chemist working for Bayer refined this exact compound into the pill we still use today. He didn't invent the idea. He just cleaned it up. Romans had already done the hard part. They'd already figured out that this particular tree, prepared this particular way, took the edge off pain and brought down a fever. It just took 18 more centuries for a laboratory to explain why. Think about what that means. Every time you've popped an aspirin for a headache, a sore hip, or to protect your heart on your doctor's orders, you've been benefiting from a plant-based discovery that a Roman legionnaire's medic could have told you about. Modern medicine didn't invent the fix. It found the receipt for something Rome had already paid for, a long, long time ago. Now, if willow bark feels almost too familiar, yes, I've heard something like that before. What I'm about to tell you next is going to sound like it belongs in a horror movie. Except it's not fiction. It's just how Romans treated an open wound. Picture this. You're a Roman soldier. You've just come off a battlefield with a nasty gash on your arm. There's no hospital, no antibiotics, no stitches kit with sterile packaging. What do the medics reach for? Wine. Straight, ordinary wine poured directly onto the wound. This wasn't a comfort measure. It wasn't, here, have a drink, you'll feel better. It was treatment. Roman military physicians used wine as a wound wash because, even without understanding germs or bacteria, they had noticed wounds cleaned with wine seem to fester less than wounds left alone. Wine is acidic. It contains compounds with genuine antimicrobial properties. It's not as effective as modern antiseptics, not even close, but compared to doing nothing, it made a real difference. This practice was so widespread across the ancient world that it even shows up in a story a lot of you will recognize. The parable of the Good Samaritan, where the injured traveler has his wounds cleaned with oil and wine before being bandaged. That's not incidental detail. That's a snapshot of standard first aid 2,000 years ago. Here's the piece that should stop you in your tracks. Modern researchers have gone back and actually tested old wine-based wound treatments in laboratory conditions, and they've found measurable antibacterial activity, not folklore, not placebo, actual inhibited bacterial growth in controlled tests. Rome didn't know the word antiseptic. They didn't know what a microbe was, but they'd stumbled onto real, working chemistry through nothing but centuries of trial, error, and careful observation on the battlefield. So next time somebody rolls their eyes at old folk remedies, remind them this one's been tested in an actual lab, using actual bacterial cultures, and it held up. And wine wasn't just for cleaning wounds. Romans didn't have the ability to distill alcohol the way we do today, so wine was, quite literally, the strongest solvent they had access to. And they used that fact constantly, in ways that would look surprisingly familiar to anyone who's ever bought herbal tincture drops at a health food store. Roman physicians would take medicinal herbs, things like wormwood, rue, hyssop, various roots, and barks, and steep them in wine for days or weeks at a time. The alcohol in the wine pulled the active plant compounds out of the plant material and into the liquid, creating what was essentially a crude, homemade tincture. This process is chemically identical, in principle, to what happens today when a company makes an alcohol-based herbal extract. Same mechanism, same goal, just a much older, much less refined toolkit. Roman medical writers like Pliny the Elder cataloged dozens, if not hundreds, of these medicinal wine preparations. Wine infused with specific herbs for stomach trouble. Wine infused with other herbs for coughs. Wine used as a delivery method to get the active ingredient into a patient's system in a form the body could actually absorb. It's the exact same logic behind why a tincture works better than just chewing on a dried leaf. Alcohol extracts more of the good stuff, and it extracts it faster. Here's why that matters to you, specifically, sitting here today. If you've ever wandered down the supplement aisle and picked up a little brown bottle labeled tincture, you were looking at the direct descendant of a Roman medicine cabinet. The wine had changed. The herbs had changed. But the underlying idea, use alcohol to pull medicine out of a plant so your body can use it, that idea is Roman. It survived every empire, every war, every century since, completely intact. Now here's where things start to get genuinely strange and genuinely impressive in a way that I think will change how you think about ancient battlefield medicine altogether. Picture a Roman military camp after a battle. Wounded soldiers everywhere. Limited supplies. No sterile bandages. No gauze. None of the packaged medical materials we take for granted. So what did Roman medics reach for? Spiderwebs. I know how that sounds. But stay with me, because this is one of the most fascinating entries on this entire list. Roman battlefield medics would gather spider silk, actual cobwebs, and pack them directly into open wounds, sometimes mixed with honey and a splash of vinegar. This wasn't some desperate, last resort improvisation, either. It was common enough practice that it shows up across multiple ancient sources, treated as a legitimate wound care technique, not a superstition. Here's what makes this remarkable instead of just gross. Spider silk, pound for pound, is stronger than steel. That's not an exaggeration for effect. That's a documented material science fact, confirmed by modern researchers studying the tensile strength of spider silk fibers. It's flexible, it's durable, and it forms a natural mesh that can help hold torn tissue together and encourage clotting, simply because of its physical structure. On top of that, researchers in recent years have started seriously investigating whether spider silk carries antibacterial properties as well. Early studies suggest certain compounds on the silk may inhibit some bacterial growth. Add honey into that mixture, which has well-documented antibacterial and wound-healing properties of its own, backed by extensive modern research and even used in some hospitals today in medical-grade form, and the vinegar, which brings its own mild antiseptic acidity to the table. And you're looking at a genuinely thoughtful, multi-ingredient wound treatment, not a random ancient superstition. An engineered solution, built from whatever materials nature made available. Here's the phrase I want you to sit with for a second. Romans were doing bioengineering before biology as a science even existed. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't have the word bacteria. But they were combining materials in a specific, repeatable way because they noticed it worked better than the alternative. That is the scientific method, functioning without the science. And that should change how you look at primitive medicine altogether. It wasn't primitive. It was observational. It was medicine built one battlefield mistake and one battlefield success at a time, over centuries, until the survivors passed down what actually worked. Now, if spiderwebs got your attention, what I'm about to describe next is, without question, one of the strangest medical ingredients in all of Roman history, and it involves ants, specifically red ants. Roman writers documented the use of red ants and the acid extracted from them as a disinfectant for wounds and skin conditions. If that sounds bizarre to you, you're not wrong, it is bizarre. But it also happens to be chemically legitimate, which is exactly why it earns a spot on this list, Instead of getting thrown out with the crocodile dung and gladiator blood remedies you've probably already heard about on other channels. Here's the actual chemistry behind it. Red ants produce something called formic acid. It's literally where the compound gets its name, from the Latin word for ant, formica. Formic acid is a genuinely antimicrobial substance. It's used today in controlled industrial and agricultural applications, specifically because it kills or inhibits certain bacteria, fungi, and parasites. Modern beekeepers even use formic acid treatments to control mite infestations in beehives because of its proven antimicrobial punch. Romans didn't know the name formic acid. They didn't know its molecular structure, but they knew that if you crushed up red ants or exposed a wound to them in the right way, you got a substance that seemed to fight off infection better than an untreated wound would. This is the pattern you're going to notice again and again throughout this entire list, and it's worth pausing on directly. Roman medicine, over and over, arrived at chemically valid answers through nothing but patient observation. No laboratories, no germ theory, no periodic table. Just centuries of this worked, so we kept doing it. Passed down from physician to physician, army camp to army camp. It's almost humbling, honestly, to realize how much they got right, using nothing but trial, error, and careful record keeping. Alright, take a breath, because this next one is the strangest entry on the entire list, and it involves something that became such a serious part of the Roman economy. The government actually taxed it. I'm talking about urine. Yes, human urine, in ancient Rome, was a legitimate, regulated commodity. There were people whose entire livelihood was collecting it. Public urinals were placed around Roman cities, specifically so this liquid could be gathered. And it was gathered in large enough quantities, for a valuable enough purpose, that the Roman Emperor Vespasian imposed an actual tax on its sale and use. There's a famous story tied to this. When Vespasian's own son complained about the tax, calling it undignified, the emperor reportedly held up a coin made from that tax revenue and said something to the effect of, "Money doesn't smell." That phrase has survived, in one form or another, for nearly 2,000 years, specifically because of this tax. So what on earth was urine used for that made it worth taxing? A few things, and some of them are going to surprise you. It was heavily used in the tanning and textile industry because the ammonia content helped process leather and clean wool. But it also shows up, documented in ancient sources, in dental and mouth rinsing formulas. Ancient peoples across the Mediterranean, including the Romans, believed the ammonia content acted as a whitening and cleansing agent for teeth. In fact, this practice persisted long after Rome fell. There are records of urine-based mouth rinses being used in parts of Europe centuries later, specifically because people believed, and to some degree observed, that it left teeth looking cleaner. Now, I want to be very clear here, because I can already hear some of you reaching for the remote. Nobody, including me, is suggesting you try this at home. This entry isn't on the list because it's a remedy you should revive. It's on the list because it tells you something genuinely important about how seriously ancient Rome took the idea of medicine as an economy. This wasn't a fringe practice done by a few oddballs in back alleys. This was regulated, taxed, and integrated into daily Roman commerce at a national level. When you think about how differently we treat waste products today, you start to realize just how resourceful and how different ancient problem-solving really was. They didn't have chemistry sets. They had observation, necessity, and absolutely no squeamishness about where a solution came from. So hold on to that thought, because it's the perfect setup for the final entry on this list, the one that takes us from strange curiosity to actual, currently validated medical science. Let's finish with the one that will probably surprise you the most. Not because it's shocking, but because it's the opposite of shocking. It's the one Roman remedy modern medicine looked at, tested rigorously, and said, yes, this actually works. Barley. Romans used barley extensively, and specifically, as an anti-inflammatory. It wasn't just a dietary staple for them, the way we might think of oatmeal today. Roman physicians and soldiers alike used barley preparations, often as a broth or a poultice, specifically to calm inflammation in the body, joint pain, gut irritation, general swelling. Gladiators, in fact, were sometimes referred to in ancient sources as hordearii, which roughly translates to barley eaters, precisely because their diet was loaded with barley to help their bodies recover and manage inflammation from constant physical trauma. Here's the part that should genuinely impress you. Modern clinical research has circled back around to barley and confirmed exactly what the Romans were onto. Studies have shown that compounds in barley, including specific fibers and antioxidants, have measurable anti-inflammatory effects in the body. Barley is recommended today by actual physicians as a dietary component that can help manage conditions like osteoarthritis and gastric ulcers, the exact same categories of inflammation Roman doctors were targeting 2,000 years ago, just described using modern clinical language instead of ancient observation. This is the one I want you to really sit with, because it ties this entire list together. Willow bark became aspirin. Wine-based wound care showed measurable antibacterial activity in modern lab testing. Formic acid from ants turned out to be a legitimate antimicrobial compound, still used in controlled settings today. And barley, something Roman soldiers were eating specifically to reduce inflammation, is recommended by modern doctors for the exact same reason, backed by modern clinical studies. This isn't nostalgia. Wasn't it quaint what the old-timers believed? This is repeated, independent confirmation that ancient observation, done carefully and repeated across generations, arrived at real answers. Answers modern science had to spend millions of dollars and decades of research to simply catch back up to. So here's where that leaves us. 7 remedies. Willow bark that became aspirin. Wine used both to clean wounds and to extract medicine from herbs. Spider silk bandages that were doing real bioengineering before biology was a word. Ants providing legitimate antimicrobial acid. A urine trade so significant it was taxed by an emperor. And barley, an anti-inflammatory so effective it's still recommended by doctors today. Different problems, different centuries, same underlying truth. Rome wasn't guessing. Rome was observing, testing, and remembering. One battlefield, one physician, one careful notation at a time. And a shocking amount of what they figured out turned out to be right. The next question, naturally, is what happened after Rome fell, whether all of this knowledge simply vanished for centuries, or whether it secretly survived, buried in monasteries, and passed hand to hand until it resurfaced during the Renaissance. That's exactly the story waiting for you in the next video on this channel. And once you see how close humanity came to losing all of this forever, you'll never look at an aspirin bottle the same way again.